All right.
Great, thanks, Linda. So to get us started, I know I see some familiar names on the participants list, but what we want to do is just get started with a couple basics about the National Flood Insurance Program so everybody's on the same page. If we don't cover something, definitely feel free to post a question in the chat and Celinda or Dennis or someone can help and answer some basic questions. But you all are here because you likely are part of a community organization and your community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program was created back in the 60s, and the real goal is to help communities manage flood risk. And as a result, flood insurance would be provided to communities and provided to the business owners and residents within that community as long as the community agrees to manage development in the floodplain. So a lot of the National Flood Insurance Program really focuses on buildings. And one of the key requirements that we're really going to touch on today is that new or substantially improved structures are required to be elevated or flood-proofed or otherwise meet different compliance standards. And so we're really going to focus on that substantial improvement and substantial damage piece today. And just as a reminder, communities that do this well and that comply with all the requirements of NFIP participating communities make flood insurance available to their residents and business owners. And though flood insurance is required for any property owner who has a federally backed mortgage in the floodplain. So that's why we do what we do, and you all are a key part of that. So a couple of basic terms to start out with first. Yeah, there we go. So we'll use these terms throughout and just want to make sure everybody has a clear picture of what these are. So we talk about the 100-year floodplain a lot. We talk about the special flood hazard area, and sometimes we just colloquially say the floodplain, but really what we mean and what we reference is you can see down at the bottom, special flood hazard area. That is the area, the floodplain that's inundated by the 1% annual chance flood or the base flood. This is the regulatory area that communities are required to manage development within on the flood insurance rate maps. Buried within that special flood hazard area is the base flood elevation. This is the what we expect floodwaters to get to in the event of a 100-year or base flood event. So the base flood elevation is a key elevation requirement for buildings. We find all of the flood data on flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance studies. Excuse me. The flood insurance rate maps are available for probably every community on this list. If you don't quite know that, definitely reach out to us and we can help you figure out exactly where they are and what they are. And the flood insurance study is where a lot of the engineering and supportive data are found, particularly the stream profiles that are used for base flood elevation determinations in riverine situations. So the other concept here is the concept of freeboard. We'll say that quite a bit throughout this presentation. This is a community-specific development standard where buildings are required to be elevated so their lowest floor is higher than the base flood elevation, and the height to which those standards are is called the freeboard. So a lot of communities have a 1-foot freeboard, which means a building should be elevated to base flood elevation plus 1 foot. So that's what freeboard means. So as we take a look at the Oregon Model Ordinance, and all of your floodplain codes should reflect this. For those of us who are joining from Washington or Idaho or someplace else, this is going to be in your state's model ordinance, and you should have something very similar to this in your floodplain regulations. So within the model ordinance, in the definitions section, are 2 definitions that are important that that essentially this training focuses on. Substantial damage, you can see this here. We've highlighted the key components of that. So damage of any origin sustained by the structure, where the cost of restoring the structure to its pre-damage condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value before the damage occurred. Essentially, our training is going to walk through what that means and how we go about doing that and what communities really need to think about. So substantial damage is a really important definition, and it kind of follows and is embedded within the definition of substantial improvement, which is essentially anything that is done to a structure where the cost would exceed 50% of the pre-improved or pre-construction market value of that structure. And substantial improvement includes substantial damage. And a key thing there is regardless of the actual repair work performed. So we'll dig into all the different components of this, but these definitions are really crucial. And if you look at your floodplain regulations and you don't see these definitions in there, definitely reach out to Celinda or myself or the state coordinator for the state you're in, and we'll help you figure out what to do. So then these definitions tie into the regulatory requirements, and we've included two key provisions here from the Oregon Model Ordinance. First of all, a floodplain development permit is required when any development activity is occurring that's horizontally within the mapped special flood hazard area. And development or construction means anything that's going to happen in the floodplain. So any rebuilding work, debris clearing, site preparation, even just adding an HVAC unit to the side of a structure, all of that is considered development and needs a floodplain development permit from you all who are presumably floodplain administrators or part of the permitting review process. And then the key component of substantial improvement is substantial damage is really found in the residential and non-residential construction requirements. So we've just put the residential construction because that's what we focus on most, but it applies to non-residential as well. You can see here it says new construction and substantial improvement of any residential structure shall have the lowest floor elevated at or above the base flood elevation, or your freeboard standard if that's what you have in your own floodplain regulations. So substantial improvement there goes back to the definitions, and the definition of substantial improvement includes substantial damage, and we talked about that definition before as well. So that's how all of this connects within floodplain management regulations, and all your regulations should look very similar to this. Hopefully you have a freeboard standard that gets buildings above the BFE. So really, what does this all mean? There's lots of kind of legal jargon that we dove through there right now. Essentially what that means is all substantially damaged structures have to be brought into compliance with whatever the current floodplain regulations are in order to be able to rebuild. So what that means is a surveyor or engineer, depending on where you're at, needs to look at the elevations of the pre-damaged building or the foundation, if that's all that's left, and make sure that what is being proposed to be rebuilt is elevated to the base flood elevation or to the freeboard standard. So as an example, if a home, say it was built back in the 50s, has their lowest floor 3 feet below the base flood elevation, and it suffers, a fire or a big flood where the cost to repair is, say, 75% of the pre-damage value, then as part of the rebuild, that homeowner is going to have to propose a building where the lowest floor is 2 or above the base flood elevation, which might mean raising the foundation that's already there or redesigning the structure so that it's elevated above that. We know that this is a big requirement that communities have to implement, and it can mean major implications for property owners. So what we try to do in this training is really provide you all tools to preempt that conversation and to have all the data and tools available. So when that conversation has to happen with a property owner, you're ready, have all the data, have all the information you need to help that process go much smoother. So in manufactured home parks, we often see substantially damaged structures. They have, they're usually a little bit lower value. And so there's kind of a lower bar to the damage that occurs. And if a manufactured dwelling is required to be elevated higher than it was before, that might mean redesigning the whole park so that more lots can be there, or the lots can be spread out so that it can accommodate stairs or ramps that might need to be installed as part of the rebuild. Substantial improvement and substantial damage provisions in codes are really crucial. They've always been a part of the National Flood Insurance Program requirements. Like I said, they're really difficult to implement. They take a lot of staff sort of emotional time. It's hard to tell someone who suffered a loss that they have to spend more money than they anticipated on the rebuild. But this is a really crucial part of making sure that property owners with buildings or homes in the floodplain rebuild their structures if they're substantially damaged to a higher level so that they will be safer the next time a flood comes around. Otherwise, all we're doing is perpetuating more and more flood damage on that property owner and future property owners. And we call that kind of the downward cycle of a disaster. And so this is a really key part of your floodplain regulations, and making sure you as communities are prepared for it is really what we're hoping for. It means when buildings are elevated as part of substantial damage, at the end of the day, it means there's going to be fewer flood losses because the buildings are going to be elevated and built to current floodplain requirements. Typically, that's going to mean if they have to purchase flood insurance or they choose to, it will save money typically on those premiums. And it means the next time there's a flood event, the community is going to recover faster because more buildings are elevated and there's likely to be less damage. And as a result, we're going to see less disaster costs overall, less money that's going to need to come to the community, and hopefully less money that people have to spend out of their savings where disaster assistance doesn't cover it. I mean, we already talked before, the higher a building is, the more in compliance with our floodplain regulations, the safer the building's going to be, and the more the family's property that they've invested in is going to be safe from flooding. There definitely are some costs for communities that don't comply with this. It means, like I mentioned before, property owners are going to be caught in that spiral of disasters. And if they don't elevate, they're going to see flood damage in the future. FEMA also takes it very seriously when communities don't comply with substantial damage. And if they don't implement that part of their regulations, communities could be suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program. We take it very seriously these days, and we definitely will be looking at communities to make sure they do it correctly while also providing lots and lots of technical assistance. If communities do get suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program, it means those property owners, especially homeowners with mortgages in the floodplain, won't be able to get flood insurance, and their mortgages may be foreclosed on, and new mortgages may not be able to happen. And also, as a result, a community that doesn't participate is also ineligible for some types of disaster assistance as a result. So really, we definitely have to, as communities that participate in the NFIP, make sure we look at this and make sure we have a plan for substantial damage. It helps to protect property. It makes sure that the burden on taxpayers is reduced because we don't need so much disaster assistance coming in. And it means that communities are going to be able to be more resilient to flooding, and that recovery afterwards is a lot faster. So going back to the definition of substantial damage and looking at how we implement the regulations, there's 4 key components. We highlighted these in the definition a few slides ago. So if we remember, damage from any origin is a key part of substantial damage. It's not just flood damage. We'll talk about the 50% rule, what that means and how we make that calculation. That's a big part of ensuring this is implemented correctly. And then we're going to look at what does it mean for the cost to repair a structure, what should be counted towards that cost and what does not need to be counted. And then market value is an easy thing to toss out, but we'll talk about what types of market value determinations we can use. So on the next slide, we see a couple examples of damage to homes. Really, damage of any origin is the key piece here. So flood damage is a really easy thing. When a flood comes through, we go evaluate structures to see how damaged they are and make sure if they cross that 50% threshold that they're being proposed to be rebuilt. It's easy to make that connection with property owners. They got flooded, they have to be built above where the flood levels are expected to go. It's a lot easier conversation to have. It is a little bit more difficult when it comes to other natural hazards, whether it's, wind damage, tornado damage, wildfires. If the big Cascadia earthquake happens, all of us floodplain managers here, hopefully we're all safe as a result of that earthquake, but our next step in our work is going to be making sure we're doing an inventory of structures in the floodplain to see whether they're substantially damaged from that earthquake. It also comes down to, we hear crazy stories of cars that run off the road and, plow into houses or plow into businesses. Someone had too much to drink and they ran off the road. If that happens to a house in a floodplain, you'll have to go look at it from a substantial damage component too. On the next slide, we look at the 50% rule. It really is a relatively straightforward equation that's out there. You take the cost to repair the damage divided by the pre-event market value. And if you multiply that by 100, you'll get a percentage. And if that percentage is greater than 50, then it is considered substantially damaged. And so we'll talk about how to calculate that cost and how to calculate the market value, but this equation is really what you're looking at. So as an example here, if we have a $150,000 home, that's what it was worth before a fire came in. And as we evaluate it and look at the cost to repair, it's coming in at about $90,000 to repair it to its pre-fire condition, regardless of whether they actually do that repair or regardless of whether they complete the repair on the entire structure. We have to look at what it would cost to bring it back to that 150,000. So if we divide 90,000 by 150,000, we get 0.6. We multiply that by 100, and that gives us a percentage of 60%. So it is 60% damaged, which is more than 50%. Thus, the home in this case would be substantially damaged. Then when we look deeper into that equation, we have to consider what are the costs of repair? What does that include and what does that not include? We'll link to a reference that talks, a reference document that talks in great detail about what to include and what not to include, but these are some examples here. So obviously any cost of the components of the building, whether it's walls, the roof, doors, cabinets, also including built-in appliances and appliances that essentially keep the building running. So electrical, HVAC systems, washer, dryer, and dishwashers as built-in appliances need to be considered as part of the costs. We have to also look at both the material and the labor costs of the reconstruction, and not just what's actually done, but what the market value of that is. So if a volunteer agency comes in and offers to repair a structure, that's fantastic for that property owner. But when it comes to floodplain management, we have to get the actual cost, the market cost of what it would cost to repair the building, even if it is volunteer labor and volunteer materials that go into it. So if we also have to look if the property owner says, yep, we're going to repair the house and we're also going to do an addition because we were thinking about that before, we've got to rope into the total costs that extra improvement that's made to the building. So that gets a little detailed, and we can talk about that with you if something like that comes up. There are a couple of things that costs that can actually be excluded from the cost to repair. So if any part of the building needs to be temporarily stabilized to make it safe to enter, and that costs the homeowner a couple $1,000s to make sure that the building is in stable condition to go in and inspect and repair, that can be excluded from the repair costs. Any outside improvements like decks, sidewalks, if there's a pool that's damaged, all of that doesn't need to be considered as cost to repair. And if a homeowner has to spend money to relocate for a period of time, that doesn't have to be included in the cost of repair either. There's a really great tool, as you can see on the next slide. There's a the substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference. You can see the cover page here. We'll make sure you get the link to this document if you don't already have it. Within it are a couple templates that communities are that we suggest communities use. this is a good example of the different components of the building and what you might look at in terms of the cost of repair, both in terms of materials and labor. So filling this out for any building is a really good idea. Then, so just kind of taking a step back, what we want to do is bring in a little bit more interactivity. I think typically we kind of just lecture and toss all this information out. So using the chat function, what do you think, just looking at the outside of the structure? Obviously, what we really need to do is look inside and outside and be able to walk around it. But just using these photos that are going to come up, type in the chat. We'll give everybody 30 seconds to type in the chat. What do you think? Do you think this building is substantially damaged? And even if it's a yes or no, would you want to take a closer look and get inside? Okay, I see some good answers here. Someone points out, yes, based on the water line of the building. The water line is very high, so we expect a lot of damage inside. That's great. It's exactly what I would say. Yes, no, I wouldn't want to go inside. That's probably fair. Okay, let's go to the next example. So looking at this is probably, we didn't get to this right after the flood occurred. So it might be a little hard to see all of the water lines here, but you can probably pick a little bit out. What do you think if this one is substantially damaged or not? And would you go inspect it? Yep, I see some yes and yes. I see some, it might be unlikely, but a good idea to go in and inspect just to be safe. Yep, that's great. This actually is a real example, and this property owner actually used the increased cost of compliance money, which we'll talk about later, to elevate the building. So this building is a good full story higher than it was before this flood event. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, what do you think if this was the only photo that you had? All we can see here is a very full and collapsed foundation down there. What do you think? You think it's substantially damaged, and would you go in and inspect it? Awesome. I see lots of yeses. Yep, someone said yes because foundations are expensive. It's definitely true. Maybe it's not terribly safe to enter this building. That's a good point, and you should definitely consider that before going inside. Yeah, unsafe to the building. In this particular community, a couple structures had such bad foundations, they had big, huge temporary beams that were put in so that you could actually go inside. Yep, Slinda points out you may not want to enter it, but you can still flag it for substantial damage. And we'll cover this in a little bit, but a homeowner can bring in additional details to fill in the blanks if it's not safe to enter. Okay, let's go to the next one. What does someone think about this example? It gets substantially damaged, and would you inspect it? Yep, I see a couple people saying it looks substantially damaged. The water line is high on this one as well. Yep, someone points out it looks like it's already been red tagged. So if a building inspector has already got to it before a floodplain manager gets there, it's probably a good idea to ask that building inspector what they found. And you can use some of that data without having to enter every single structure. An interesting point here, all of that dirt is actually silt from a river flooding. So there were many feet of silt that were brought onto this site as part of this flood event. Okay, let's look at the next one. So these properties were in the floodplain. And as we can tell, it wasn't a flood that caused this damage. So would you inspect it, and do you think it's substantially damaged? See lots of yeses, and yep, probably no need to inspect. That's a good point. You can probably tell just from the outside that it is likely substantially damaged. Okay, great. Let's go to the next one. I think there's a couple more. What do you think about this? Is it substantially damaged, and would you inspect it? See, yes, because there's no roof. Definitely a good idea. Yep. Good opportunity for a drone to look inside. Absolutely. Yeah. Interestingly, this house didn't actually cross the substantial damage threshold. Enough of the superstructure was still in good shape. So this one barely didn't cross the 50% threshold. But definitely the community inspected this and looked inside. Yep, now it's a convertible. Absolutely. Okay, I think there might be one more. Nope. Okay, that's it. Well, thanks everybody for participating in that. I guess we had lots of yes situations and not too many maybes or likely not. Okay, anyway, so as we go back and think about the equation, we have the cost to repair divided by the pre-damage market value. And so defining market value can be a little challenging for communities because the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't have a definition. Really, all that's said in the substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference is that market value is the price that a willing seller would pay. Again, it's hard to define that without an actual transaction there, but we do have some guidance as to what can be used for market value and what cannot be used for market value. So in general, if there is an appraisal that has been done on the property before the damage, that's the best source of market value information. Floodplain administrators should still look at that for validity. If a building is very clearly in the $100,000 to $150,000 appraisal range, and an appraisal comes back and appraises at $500,000, you might want to look closer and maybe get a second opinion. Another key here is that the market value is only for the structure, not for the entire property. So it does not include land value. It just includes the market value of the structure, not the attached deck or a pool or a driveway or something like that. It's just the structure. So an appraisal that includes a value of just the structure can definitely be used if it's reasonable. We often suggest that the assessed value, which is information that's much more readily accessible, that can be used as the first pass to apply to the buildings, especially substantially damaged buildings. Sometimes that assessors include a market adjustment. So be sure to understand whether that's used in your county or in your area, whether the assessed value is say 90% of market value, you want to adjust up for that. The other thing that can be used in certain circumstances, and it's a little complicated to actually implement, but the structure's actual cash value minus depreciation can be used where the assessed value isn't as good and there isn't a ton of comparable sales to get good appraisals. Those are pretty limited circumstances. We typically suggest using the assessed value. Really the big key in using market value and defining market value for structures is making sure you're being consistent. What most floodplain administrators do is use the assessed value, and then they allow property owners to bring in an appraisal that might further refine that value of the pre-damaged structure, or if used in substantial improvement, the pre-improved value of the structure. So ensuring consistency and ensuring kind of a lowercase a appeals process is really key for market value. So at the end of the day, if a building does cross that 50% threshold, it's really important that the requirement be put in place that the substantially improved damaged house must be elevated so the lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation or your community freeboard. And we implement those requirements similar to what we do for new structures. So we often see crawl spaces for properties and houses, especially in Oregon. And so making sure that the crawl spaces have the 1 square inch to 1 square foot flood openings, that's a key component of ensuring that a substantially improved structure is elevated to the appropriate level. And any type of utility systems have to be elevated to the BFE or freeboard as well. So implementing the requirements that we typically see for new construction for substantial improvement on substantially damaged buildings is a really key component of this. And making sure that the appropriate elevation information is out there, that the property owner has that, is going to be really key too. So getting an elevation certificate on the building in its damaged state, like you can see in this example here, is really important to be able to establish how high it needs to be elevated upon the rebuild if it's substantially damaged. When it comes to manufactured homes, manufactured dwellings, the same requirements are there. It's a slightly different in Oregon, where the bottom of the longitudinal chassis frame has to be at or above the BFE or the freeboard. It's a little bit different than the top of the bottom floor in stick-built homes. And it's also important to remember in Oregon, in coastal high hazard areas, it has to be a foot above the BFE or higher already. And a real key part of manufactured dwellings is that they have to be adequately anchored. That's a little bit more challenging. It has to be designed specifically. It's a little bit different than stick-built homes where they're kind of anchored as part of their design. And it's important to remember that any electrical crossover connections have to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation for manufactured dwellings as part of Oregon building codes and floodplain codes. And for recreational vehicles, we have to make sure that recreational vehicles are fully licensed and ready for highway use and on site for 180 days or less. If they're proposed to be there for more than 180 days, they essentially have to be treated as manufactured dwellings and anchored and elevated to the appropriate elevation. Yep, and then the next slide goes into the floodway requirements. So if a substantially damaged building is rebuilt exactly in the same footprint, then the floodway requirement is kind of met by that. But in general, any development that's associated with a rebuilding in the floodway needs to still comply with the requirement to demonstrate through a hydrologic and hydraulic analysis that no rise will be caused anywhere in the community as a result of that development. So if a building is being rebuilt and they're expanding the footprint of the building, they'll have to do an H&H analysis to make sure they meet that no rise requirement. So it's really important when you're thinking, if a big disaster event comes in and you're starting to think about substantial damage, it's really key to make sure you understand which properties are in the floodway and which ones aren't, to go back and make sure you're tracking much closer the development to make sure that no rise requirement is met. After disasters, time is ripe for variance requests. And while politicians especially may be looking to help people rebuild, they might want to propose variances or propose exceptions. The really important thing to remember, and floodplain administrators are the ones that are the gatekeepers here, variances should not be granted for substantially damaged buildings, variances for floodplain requirements. There really is no reason to not require a substantially damaged building to be elevated above the base flood elevation or freeboard status. We know it's expensive. We know it can be really difficult for a property owner to do that, but that is not a reason for a variance or an exception to the rule. The only exception that is generally granted is for historic structures, and it's really important to look at the definition of that in the Oregon Model Ordinance or in your own floodplain management regulations. And then lastly, violations are a big thing that pops up when it comes to post-disaster rebuilding. So just make sure that you are doing your part. Any violation, including substantial damage violations, whether they do more than 50% and the community didn't catch it, that's still a violation, or someone just willfully ignored the substantial damage requirement. It's really important to track those and make sure that you're correcting violations. And then lastly, we've mentioned before, there's a really great resource document. This is a fantastic document that goes through all aspects of substantial improvement and substantial damage, from understanding how to make those damage determinations and some tips and tools for doing that, to some of the specifics. It goes into much more detail than we'll be able to get in this presentation about how to administer those substantial damage requirements, what to consider when looking at the different components of buildings. And it has some great templates for both letters and some information like we showed before, where property owners should put all the different information for the different building components. So this link is a long one. It's hard to copy down. I'm going to put it in the chat because I'm going to turn it over to Celinda now, and we'll be sure you have the link afterwards as well. So that's it for me. I'll turn it back over to Celinda.
Thanks, Mitch. We're going to pause here for just a sec. There's a couple great questions that have come in the chat, and I thought it'd be good. I'll read them off to you. I thought it'd be good to address them to everybody since they're some good questions. The first one was from Tommy, and it was, if a substantial damage, is it cumulative with substantial improvement? I.e., if a structure was 25% substantially damaged and then they had a 30% substantial improvement, would that combine to make it trigger the need for being brought into compliance?
That's a great question. So some communities do have a higher standard that tracks cumulative improvement and damage over a defined period of time for a building. So sometimes that's 5 years, sometimes that's 10 years. So anything within that 10-year period is combined. So if someone does a 20%, bathroom addition that increases the value 20%, then that's calculated in year 2. And then if 5 years down the line, a big flood event comes through and there's 40%, 45% damage, then that is added all together, and the substantial damage threshold or substantial improvement / substantial damage threshold is crossed. So if your community has that, understand how to implement it. If your community doesn't have that requirement, and I would say most don't, then it's only cumulative if the projects are being done at the same time. So if someone gets damaged by 30% 1 year, and a couple years later after they've rebuilt, they want to do add a garage addition that might be 20%, that isn't necessarily tracked cumulatively automatically. You can see there's a little bit of gray area in between that, but if you have something like that come up, where you're questioning whether they should be included all together, you can definitely reach out to Celinda, Dennis, or myself for extra help.
Thanks, Mitch. All right, just 2 more for you while we have the group here. What about decks that are structurally dependent on the dwelling? Are they something that's included in the substantial damage assessment, or is their value taken into consideration?
That's a good question. I would need to do a little bit more research on that. I think that the answer is no. I don't think that those are included in the substantial damage calculation, but I can't say with 100% certainty. So we'll figure that out, unless Linda or Dennis, you know the answer.
Yeah, I believe that's correct, that they're not. It's unless they are walled, like more than 2 rigid walls and a roof over them, so an enclosed deck, that would count as a structure or part of a structure. And then the last one was, if an RV is placed in a floodway less than 180 days, does it need a no-rise certificate?
The RV itself doesn't, but anything related to the RV, so the pads that might be installed, any sort of like quick disconnect utility system that's installed that might have like a box or something to it, or anything related to an RV park like a clubhouse or anything like that would definitely need to comply with the floodway standard. But just the placement of a recreational vehicle itself does not necessitate a no-rise.
I will say that is unless your community has adopted any higher standards. There are a few
Absolutely.
communities that have prohibitions on certain development activities or require a no-rise for everything, even temporary placement. And so the last one, and I'll just answer this really quick, non-residential RVs, they have the same requirements essentially. So they still have the 180-day leeway period. If it's past the 180 days, then they would need a no rise, even though it's a non-residential. Okay, well, thank you, Mitch. I appreciate that. And Mitch, as he said, is going to go ahead and put that desk reference link into the chat. And so I'm going to go ahead and move forward with the presentation. And then a little bit, I'm going to pause and share the screen over to Daniel Stobe to give a little bit of a preview of a new tool we're going to talk about in a sec. So what I'd like to go over with you are post-event responsibilities. So hopefully this won't happen to you in your time as a floodplain manager or whatever your role is at the community. But in case it does, it's really important that you as community staff are aware of what your responsibilities are, specifically what the duties are for a floodplain manager, because there's actually a significant body of work that comes on after any type of a disaster if structures within a floodplain are damaged. The recent 2020 wildfires are a really good example of this. So the community responsibility is to ensure that any damage is assessed to structures within the floodplain to determine if that damage is substantial. So whether it qualifies as substantial damage, and then to inform property owners of that determination and of the requirements that go along with it if it is determined to be substantially damaged. It's also essential that communities then apply the requirements, as in making sure that variances aren't granted unless they meet the requirements for variances within your floodplain regulations, making sure that the requirement to bring structures into compliance when they are substantially damaged is applied and enforced. And those can be hard conversations to have, especially with elected officials. So we do really encourage you to do some outreach to your elected officials and your community supervisors and leadership regarding this requirement and these responsibilities, so that it isn't a surprise, hopefully, after an event, because it can be a tough conversation to have if they don't have awareness of it beforehand. Ensure floodplain permits are obtained for any debris clearance, for any significant activity within the floodplain, development activity, not just, the general person going out and picking up some trash off, but once they bring out a bulldozer to start clearing things or a backhoe or something significant that needs a permit, grand disturbing work. For any new reconstruction, people like to get in there really quick. So it's really important to make sure you get notice out to them that a floodplain permit is required and that a structure might be substantially damaged, because they tend to try to turn things around like any of us would as quickly as possible to try to get back into homes. So one thing is, if in wildfires we saw, but it can happen in other events, if you can't put notice of that on a property door or in a mailbox in a way that will get to the property owner, if you don't have mailing addresses for everybody, be sure to put something to this regard on websites, on any notifications or places where the local community would get that information. Even you can put signs up on entrances to subdivisions or just in common roadways, the grocery store, common access points. However you can get this word out, you really want it to get out there so that people get permits, come in and have a conversation about substantial damage before they go and do work, so you don't end up with a lot of violations to deal with people that have already been through a lot. The other thing we want to say is it is your responsibility to make sure that your emergency managers, your staff that are going to go out in the field and deal with things, have the latest information about where that flood risk is. Especially in a wildfire, they might not be thinking about flood. But it's important to flag for them that there were structures in the floodplain that were damaged. If you have a list of those to provide them, even better, or a geospatial layer, but making sure that they have the most accurate data. So the determination process, it's really essential that you review structures to determine if the cost to repair that damage are going to be more than 50% of that pre-market value cost. And as Mitch said, we typically recommend you start using the assessor's data for that market value cost to get a good idea. One of the real important approaches here is to realize as a floodplain manager, you might not be able to go out, and it might be safe to enter some buildings, as we saw in those exercises. Please don't go into anything unsafe. You might not even be able to access the property. If you don't have a building official with you, you might only be looking at it from the road. Take photos, get as much information as you can. We're going to talk a little bit more about some options to collect damage assessment, some new tools and ways to do that in a minute. But it's important that you do assess the damage to every structure and make a determination. And initially, this may be a bit of a triage exercise where you're flagging properties as definitely substantially damaged, it washed downstream, it's off its foundation, it's completely caved in, or it's gone from a fire. It is clearly not substantially damaged. The water never got near it. There's absolutely no fire damage. It's except for maybe some smoke internally. Or you can't tell initially. And it's going to take digging into things when it's time to rebuild and look at permits and look at the details then. So the floodplain administrator's role is to develop an inventory of all the substantially damaged assessed structures and make determinations as to which ones are substantially damaged using the information available. And once I said at the beginning, this will be a triage exercise. You know, put them into those three categories: clearly yes, clearly no, and can't tell until you get more information. What we'll talk about in a sec is some options to collect that data using other resources in your community. But it's important that you look through all the photos and information, and you do want to get photographic information for this, because say somebody doesn't rebuild for 10 years. You want to be sure that you're flagging a structure is substantially damaged in your permit files. You want to make sure you're flagging it in your electronic permitting system. And you want to make sure you have record of the photos and the information about the damage. Because there can be some cases where that information is lost, and that makes it really hard to verify the damage that did occur. So a couple of the key things you want to be getting for every structure is the age of the structure, the market value. Like I said, initially that may be the assessor data, the age of construction, so that you know if it's a pre-firm home, which means it was built before your first flood insurance rate maps took effect, before your first floodplain regulations were there. Typically, that's a home prior to the 1970s here in Oregon. Almost all of our communities joined either in the 70s or the 80s. And some other information like type of foundation, what type of construction it was. And you're going to work with your emergency managers and your other folks using some of the new tools we're going to talk about to collect that data and information. And please be rest assured that if a disaster does happen, I'll be reaching out to you. Mitch or Dennis will be reaching out to you and offering to hold your hands, provide some assistance if this happens. It's also really important, this is really crucial, that you prepare to do outreach. I mentioned about the different ways you can do it. It's just really vital that you do outreach both internally to your staff and to your elected officials, but also to your community and your emergency manager about substantial damage requirements and what it means for anybody that has a structure damaged in a floodplain due to any type of disaster or a house fire. A tree falls on it during a windstorm. All of those things count. The damage needs to be assessed. So there is a new substantial damage assessment option. The State of Oregon Office of Emergency Management recognized that a lot of people are going out in the field doing damage assessments for kind of different purposes, mainly around trying to get declarations for presidential disasters so that we can get disaster aid and assistance at the federal level, but also for substantial damage for floodplain and other needs. And so they designed a geospatial tool to try to make it easier to collect all this information at one time, so people aren't seeing just tons of people coming out and assessing their properties individually. And one great thing that Daniel Stowe, who's on here, I'm going to do a little presentation on this in a second, a demo, did was work with me to put together a substantial damage component, where damage assessors in the field can actually go out and use this app and collect the key information we'd ask you to collect when you're doing a substantial damage assessment in the field, and take photos, etc. That information can all get uploaded into a floodplain manager dashboard, and you can do a desk review from your office. So if you're not the one actually doing damage assessments, if you have a building official, which is typically a party that's involved, or someone at your emergency management office goes out and actually does that in the field, they can collect this information. You can access it back in the office and enter in some information they probably won't have in the field, such as the assessor's data, et cetera. And you can make that triage determination from your desk essentially, and then create data layers or Excel files that show which ones are substantially damaged, which ones are not, and which ones are it's unclear. So this is a really great new tool and a great way to do it. We used to have to go out with clipboards and a spreadsheet, write things down by hand, take photos, and try to tag along with the other assessment teams. While you can still do that, this is a great new option. One of the things I'd encourage you to do is be sure that if you do have your properties identified in a geospatial layer or that are in the special flood hazard area, or if you do have your special flood hazard area boundary and information in a geospatial format like GIS, I'd encourage you to provide that. Make sure your emergency manager is aware of it, knows about it, and can include it so that when they're in the field, they have access to that layer as well to know when a structure is in a floodplain and they should use this component. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and turn things over to Daniel to do a live demo.
Awesome. Just a quick sound check that everyone can hear me okay?
Yep, you're great.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Celinda, and thanks for inviting me on the call today. So a little bit of a demo. Celinda talked a lot about the history for, involving this additional component with damage assessment. And really, we talked quite a bit already about the 2020 wildfires, and this is one of the things that came out from it. As you know, lots of jurisdictions were impacted by the wildfires back in 2020. And one of the things that we noticed was there wasn't a consistency with how the damage assessment data was being collected. And from this, we developed this damage assessment project to allow for a single tool to be used to collect this information consistently across the state of Oregon. And when we engaged our partners on this, Celinda mentioned, hey, what about the substantial damage thing? Because we don't want to have redundant asks to the same property. And in that effort, we really wanted to show you guys what the tools are, a little bit about how to use them. So what was mentioned earlier was this is a GIS utility. This is a GIS tool, but it uses a software app called Quick Capture and Survey 123. So you can load it. Sorry, my screen isn't allowing me to show my phone very well here, but you can load it on a smart device and go out and collect information using just your smartphone. And from that, if you go to our main damage assessment site, I have it posted in the chat there. There's some information that talks about the project overview, what it is, what it does, and how to use it. So all of this information is using the ArcGIS Online platform. Now, some communities out there already have access to ArcGIS Online. We can certainly utilize those same accounts that you have, but if you do not have an ArcGIS Online account, we can supply free of charge accounts for use for collecting damage assessment data. The first document, just to go over real quick, is our project reference guide. It talks about the overview of the damage assessment types out there. And primarily, we're focusing on individual assistance, so home and business impacts. And through this, we're talking about what steps to use in conducting damage assessments. Certainly for floodplain managers, you guys are going to be tagging in the hip pocket of emergency management staff that are being deployed in the field or volunteers. But there's also the capability to collect this data without a floodplain manager in the pocket. Typical information that's collected relate to the damage categories. So we have a variety of different damage categories ranging from unaffected to minor, major, destroyed, etc. And this guide walks you through what each of the different components of the damage assessment are, how to collect that information, what tools can be used in collecting that in Survey 123, etc. Additionally, on here, we have our form design template that shows on each of the different types of form, because we have a business form in addition to home form, to be able to see and determine what elements are being collected for each of the forms that are used out there, with M's being mandatory and O's being optional. But really where the real bread and butter is on this project is what can you do once the data is collected? So based upon what jurisdiction you're in, you're going to be granted access to your own page for your specific jurisdiction. So cities will be rolling up into counties in this particular case, but this is taking a look at Polk County. and we can view the details for any of the damage assessment data that is collected for this particular jurisdiction. And on here, we can see the full details. We'll also, as we zoom in, see little dots that indicate all of the damage assessments that were collected. We also have the ability to download those records as a CSV, which is a spreadsheet, or other file types as well. And those that have a major GIS capability, you're able to use this in your own mapping applications pretty easily. But this is one component here. You're able to view, interact with, and download that data. We can also see all of the attachments. You can tell we did some testing in here for all of the damage assessment data that was collected. But really for this particular group is the substantial damage assessment review dashboard. So on this dashboard, it shows all of the records that were collected for your specific jurisdiction, with a quick little guide on the right that talks about how to use this dashboard. And then on the far left-hand side is a list of all of those records. And you'll notice these are colored in red, which means that a floodplain manager has not gone through the review process for these particular records. So really, to review it, if you're back at home base, you can click on any one of these records. It will zoom into that particular property that was assessed. And you can see the information that was collected out there in the field, to include the photo of the damage there. And you're able to see the information about the location, those details, when the incident started, what incident it was, what was the damage category, and the option that describes the major damage, followed by some questions about the construction. So this can be done out there in the field. And then really some interesting components here is the property in a mapped special flood hazard area? So as we zoom in here, this is in the 100-year floodplain. So we can tell, yes, it is in the special flood hazard area. And I have some supplemental questions. And these are based upon the requirements that Celinda had sent over related to determining what is considered to be a substantial damage assessment. So I can enter in here the estimated market value of the structure. Was I able to inspect the interior of the property? No, from the field. Percent damage to the foundation, and I enter in a numeric value in here, which represents the percent. Estimated damage to the framing and masonry. So I'm filling out percentages for all of these different categories that represent various aspects of a substantial damage assessment. So as I enter in this information, on the back end, what's going to happen is all of these percentages are then calculating on the back end the estimated repair costs based upon the market value multiplied by this percent of damage here. So a lot of stuff that's happening on the back end that simplifies the process of being able to make those determinations of impact to a given area. So you'll see the total estimated repairs come to this amount here, 48,295, and then the damage percentage of market value. These are automatically calculated. So as you're entering this information, you can see those numbers populate into the form here to do that instant analysis on whether or not it meets that 50% threshold. So some neat capability that we have here. You can enter in some additional comments, add additional photos as necessary. And then once you're done reviewing the particular record, you change this floodplain manager designee reviewed to yes, hit submit, and that will then update this record in a couple minutes to where it'll show as green, which indicates that it has been reviewed. And these values will be updated to reflect the calculations that were done on the back end related to the percent damage and then the substantial damage percent there. So neat capabilities that we're able to simply click in a particular area and do these types of quick assessments that are meeting the needs of the communities out there for determining what properties are substantial damage properties. So that was pretty much kind of the overview for what I wanted to show and demonstrate for you all this afternoon. But certainly welcome any questions or comments that folks have on it. And if you need access to this, please let me know. I will post my contact information here in the chat. Certainly happy to engage with you guys further on this. I know that we do have some out-of-state participants on the call today, and unfortunately, I don't believe that other states have this capability up and running, but I would suggest reaching out to your local or your representatives with emergency management or your representatives with the components for DLCD in your states. So really, thank you all very much for paying attention to this, and feel free to check out that link that I posted in the chat there for our main hub site for a lot more details on this. Thanks, Celinda.
Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate it. Daniel was just essential in doing all the hard work to actually create this tool. We gave him the parameters. I provided him the spreadsheet that FEMA Region 10 typically uses. And just to clarify, we use this instead of the SDE estimator that FEMA has out there, because that estimator is really designed for larger scale disasters than we typically see, as in thousands or many thousands of properties impacted, when we see more on average of 1,000 or less in a flood event. It can be more in the wildfires, of course, impacted. We tend to use a tool like this instead of the SDE, just because of the complexity of the SDE estimator. So this, just to be clear, it's not the same thing. It is different. This is an Oregon-specific tool Daniel created on our behalf after reviewing the information we provided him. And I can't thank you enough, Daniel, for doing that. I think it's really going to be a game changer for floodplain managers after a disaster to obtain and review information. So thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to share my screen again. And we'll pick back up the presentation. So please definitely, there's a link in the chat. There's a link in the slides. We will provide the slides to attendees afterwards. Please talk to your emergency managers about this tool and make sure they're aware of the substantial damage component, and talk about how you could use it with them. If you have written standard operating procedures, consider including that in any procedures around post-disaster work or during a disaster damage assessment work. So definitely keep this in mind. And with that, we're going to go on to another exercise really quick. If you want to put in the chat this little exercise here, what's the percent damaged for this property? And so it gives an example. Assessor value from 2021 was 121,500. There's a damage estimate. Anybody want to take a guess at what the substantial damage percentage is? We'll see who's my really quick math people here. I'll show you the answer in a moment, but we'll let a few guesses come in on chat. Do you think it's substantially damaged or not based on what you're seeing here? All right, and I'll go ahead to the next slide. We've got some yeses. Great. So total is 68,900 compared to the pre-damage market value. You get 57%. So yes, this would be considered substantially damaged. What are the next steps for your community to take in this situation? If you had all this information, had that level of detail shown on the previous slide, your next step should be to issue a substantial damage determination letter. That letter is really important because property owners are going to need that to provide it to their flood insurance, enable them to access increased cost of compliance insurance coverage. And what that is, ICC, is basically whenever someone has NFIP flood insurance, if they deal with a substantial damage situation and they need to rebuild, they get an extra bonus of money, essentially, through their increased cost of compliance rider that's attached to their insurance policy, comes standard in NFIP policies. And what that does is give them typically around $30,000 extra to help cover some of the costs of bringing that structure into compliance when they rebuild. Now, given current construction costs, and it doesn't go a long way, but it's still something. But they need a substantial damage determination letter to access that. So it's important that you do provide the letters. You'll also need to provide them for your records so that that letter gets stored in the property file, so that if someone takes years to rebuild, they come back in 10 years later, there's a letter in the file that clearly identifies that structure as being substantially damaged, so that when you go through the permit process with them, you ensure that that structure is brought into compliance. It's important to put that determination letter in kind of at the time, because you don't want to be calculating substantial damage 10 years down the track and using newer assessor data. You need to be sure you're using the assessor data from the time of the event. So it's important to make sure these letters are done and issued and sent out and provided to the property owners. So from there, we're going to go ahead to the next slide, which is floodplain administrator's role continued. So we've talked a lot about getting the word out and about getting it out to your elected officials, your staff, et cetera. And there's press releases, letters, signs. We have templates that we can help you with. So what I wanted to flag is that if you don't already have copies of these templates, I've sent out lots of them to our Oregon Floodplain Manager email listserv. If you're on that, you may have gotten copies before. We have some of this available online as well. We'll be posting more of it to our NFIP website here in Oregon soon. If you are from another state, you can talk to your state NFIP coordinator and ask them for templates. All the other states in our region have something similar to this, and most other regions do as well. And to keep you from trying to recreate the wheel in a probably pressure-laden situation, please feel free to use and utilize these templates that we can provide. They're everything from content you can go on social media, to website content, to letters and outreach materials, or things you can post, signs you can post, like I said. In the wildfires, we had so much destruction, there was nothing left tall vertical to post a sign to. So the idea was people printed out larger signs and put them at the entrance to subdivisions or on key roadways. The cost repair worksheet and other forms, it's important that you have access to those and that you're aware of them, and that you provide that information about what costs are included and what costs are not included to the property owners. I actually encourage you use the list that's available. We showed it on another slide from the FEMA Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference Guide, and that you provide that form that lists what costs they have to include, what they don't, and be sure to highlight the part that they need to put the market value for those activities, even if it's donated or volunteered, or they already had the spare windows sitting around or something. They need to use the market value of those. If they don't have that market value information, which they can get from getting quotes or pricing things out at the local hardware store, you can actually tap your building official and ask them for kind of the blue book value of that activity or those things. There's also, there is kind of another optional template where if you're just not getting information from a property owner that passes the straight face test, say they're going to rewire the whole house for $200. We all know these days, unfortunately, electric is not that cheap for that type of work. You can use some other forms that they provide to have them kind of notarize and encourage them to provide you with better data. I will say it is up to your community to verify that what's collected and what they provide you as costs is reasonable. So just accepting the costs from them doesn't work. You have to go through them potentially with your building official and make sure those costs seem at least past the straight face test. Now this press release templates that we're providing here, these are just some examples. And I wanted to raise these up because there's two key things. One is that there's permit requirements, and the other is the substantial damage determination and what that means for rebuilding. And it's really important that both of these go out, especially to groups, volunteer groups and philanthropy groups that like to come in and do debris clear up and want to help get everybody cleaned up quickly. Those groups are fantastic. We don't want to slow them down, but it's important that you do provide information and get it out there that floodplain permits are needed for development activity in a floodplain, especially anything substantial. About the time they're going to be pulling out old foundations, doing groundworks, or, bulldozing through and making giant piles. A couple of things to consider for debris cleanup are really where are those piles going to go and how are they going to get removed? If they're moved the same day, that's one thing. If they're going to sit there for a long time in a floodplain, that can actually create a bit of an issue long term. So just keep that in mind. The other really important thing on notices is making sure that you send them out to the resident if the structure still stands, because you may have renters there. And it's important for them to know because they may also start doing kind of repair activities in lieu of the property owner getting involved in some situations. A floodplain administrator's role continues. There's a lot to it, and it's why we're having these trainings today. Talk to elected officials. There are some options where you can look at waiving your fees. You can also look at simplified permits for debris cleanup, where in Oregon, we consider it a type 1 permit, and something you can do to quickly expedite it, where they can just provide a limited amount of information, simpler than perhaps your regular floodplain permit development form. And they can provide one map to specify the whole area they're going to do it for and apply the permit to multiple properties potentially. So for debris cleanup, there's some fast track options. Waiving fees is something you can talk about with your elected officials. And just make sure that you're also doing some self-care in terms of documenting the hours, tracking how much work this is taking, communicating that to your manager, et cetera, and letting them know how much work it is. There's been some cases recently after the wildfire that DLCD provided some grants to provide some consultant technical assistance to local communities who were just overwhelmed with the substantial damage and rebuilding permitting process from a floodplain perspective. So be sure to communicate that to your supervisors and to us here at the state so we can do what we can to help you if you ever deal with this situation. The last couple of things, it's really important record keeping. Record keeping at this time is more important than ever, although it always is in floodplains. Be sure to keep as detailed records as you can as to staff time. And if you employ extra staff, somebody's working overtime, somebody's pulled in to help you that doesn't normally work in floodplain things as a floodplain manager, be sure to document that. Document the hours they do and the activities. This is really important because you can get under Section 1206, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, you can get 75% of the costs that go beyond your normal operating costs. So say normally you pay one staff person for 50% of their time to do floodplain management work. If they have to spend all their time for floodplain management work and you bring another person in, you could get 75% of the cost for that 50% of one person and the other person entirely covered potentially and reimbursed to your community. But you have to have the documentation to support that. So you need who it was, their normal hours versus the hours they're working to show it went beyond what they're normally paid to do on floodplains, and what they worked on. And it has to be quite detailed to get it reimbursed. So if you need help with that or have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to Mitch, Dennis, myself, etc. And the other thing is to look at when you're getting photos from individuals in the community, from your emergency management team, from residents just in general, especially on social media. If people post photos, provide photos that capture substantial damage, capture structures, capture the flooding, it's a really great idea to have one repository that's collecting all that information so that you can keep it and have access to it, scan through it to see if any of the structures you're looking at are covered in those photos, and create a good record, especially in a flood event, of the impact to the floodplain and the structures in the floodplain from that disaster activity. So there are also FEMA and HUD and sometimes other funds available for recovery and mitigation projects. And one of the key things to do is to realize that there is a mitigation conversation that goes into rebuilding. And typically in the rush to rebuild and get people back into homes, it can be easy not to take that step, not to do that. It is important to look at some of the options. After a disaster, if it's a federally disaster declared or presidential declared disaster, there's typically hazard mitigation grant program grant funding available that covers 75% of the cost to do things like elevate structures, relocate, buy out, etc. Depending on the situation for the structure and the damage, you might see situations like a manufactured home park. You might see opportunities through HUD to address that. There's a lot of opportunities to look at mitigation, look at building back better or safer, maybe changing the layout of a park so that the structures are all aligned outside of the floodplain, if that's an option, and you have open space in the floodplain area. There are some opportunities that come with disasters to rebuild better, and it's important to think about and have those conversations when they occur. You can even be as proactive as looking at the areas in the floodplain now and considering if they were all substantially damaged, what your opportunities would be in advance of a disaster. That might seem like a big lift, but for some small communities, it's not actually that hard to do. And just be sure you're having those conversations with elected officials and you're tracking the availability of post-disaster mitigation assistance dollars, HUD dollars, et cetera. I will note, this is important, HUD requirements, that funding that comes through from HUD or CAN for recovery after a disaster, if it's in a floodplain, it can't be used to fund any redevelopment or rebuilding within the floodway, and for any structures in just the regular SFHA, your AE zones, et cetera. It can only be used to fund it if the structure is going to be elevated, so that lowest floor is 2 foot above the base flood elevation, which is a higher standard than a lot of our communities have here in Oregon. So just important to know that about HUD. And the other thing is just to make sure that your elected officials, once again, are really aware that there's a role for you as floodplain managers to play in time, commitment that takes, and floodplain regulations to consider whenever a disaster occurs or whenever there's damage to structures in the floodplain. For emergency housing, you're going to get a lot of requests for, locations and information. And if your community is really impacted by floodplains, it can be a tough situation when they're trying to find places to put temporary trailers. We dealt with this after the wildfires. It's important to be clear with anybody dealing with emergency housing what the floodplain regulations are for RVs. Temporary trailers typically are considered under that RV. If they're going to be there longer than the 180 days, they'll need to be anchored and elevated like manufactured dwellings. This can be a sticky point and something they want to consider in terms of the extra cost or some of the restrictions. So keep that in mind and be sure that that information gets shared with anybody involved with looking at temporary housing for your community after a disaster. So a summary, important things, we've covered a lot. Substantial damage requirements. Make sure to review any floodplain development and building permit applications. Make sure to note if structures are substantially damaged and issue determination letters. Make sure to document your assessment work. Use that tool that Daniel's provided if you can. And be sure you have an option in there to export into Excel or to export into a number of different formats, depending on what your computer technologies are at your community. That information will be requested by myself, typically the state NFIP coordinator of your state, and by FEMA. It's information you're going to want to have, and it'll also probably be discussed at your next community assistance visit, which is where we come in and review your floodplain management program. We tend to do those after disasters for communities to make sure everything went to track and there's nothing they need help with after a disaster. And so be sure you've got that information saved and you're compiling it. Even if it's just 2 structures impacted, you still need to do that work and have that record. Determine if there's any development that has to be brought up if there is substantial damage, and have those conversations. Include your local officials so they're aware. Make it really clear what the variance restrictions are. Ensure all the development that occurs, even if it's non-structural, meets the requirements, so excavation and fill. And do keep an eye when people rebuild. Sometimes they want to now put a deck in that's attached that goes all the way down to the river, or they want to build their house in a different spot that puts it into a new flood zone. Be sure to keep an eye and have those conversations. And do document your decisions, be transparent. It's a good time to pull out your standard operating procedures if you have those documented for how you process permits, so folks know you're not picking on them. That's just how you handle this permit process. It applies to everybody. Look at any flexibility you have around simplified forms for debris clearance and for fee waivers, and just keep in communication with your elected officials and your community members as much as you can about the requirements that are going to impact your community. Now, a little bit really quick on flood after fires. It's important to note that whenever a fire happens, it does change the landscape in a floodplain, and it does temporarily, could be 2 years, could be 5, we're learning maybe even 8 years, impact the flood risk and make it stronger downstream of burn scar areas. And that's because it essentially bakes the earth, creates kind of like clay, it erodes typically, or a lot of the vegetation is gone, which can cause to a lot more erosion and issues. So it's important to know that the flood risk can change slightly after a fire, and FEMA or any other party at this time isn't able to put out kind of new maps rapidly. It's still a process to try to show or provide information about how that risk could change. If you'd like information about that, you're concerned that the flood risk has changed downstream of burn scar areas, please, you can reach out to your state NFIP coordinators. There's also this great team called the Silver Jackets team, which is a group of federal and state agencies that come together and try to help communities with identifying flood risks, mitigating them, and tools to help make floodplain management easier. And through those groups, FEMA, the Silver Jackets, your state programs, there may be tools or assistance we can offer in identifying that additional flood risk and communicating it. So there's a lot of new outreach tools FEMA has that you can share with your residents via social media or any other method you have to get information out. It's also really important that people maybe not in the special flood hazard area are notified that they might have some potential additional flood risk and they should consider getting flood insurance. Because while they may not have regulatory requirements, it doesn't mean the water can't get there. As we all know that have worked floods, FEMA's floodplain maps don't show the full picture of flood risk. There can be additional flood risk beyond, especially considering stormwater impacts or other things that can happen. And so it's important that they realize that they might need flood insurance this coming flood season as well, if they don't have it, and that takes 30 days to take into effect. We also have the post-wildfire playbook. This is a great resource and tool for communities to look through to see just all the things we've talked about, options they can do, information resources, just some great templates and tools. So if you haven't checked that out, please consider doing that, and I'll post that link in the chat at the end. And there's also a landslide hazard guide. We do flag while we're focused on flood, there's lots of intersections between wildfire, landslide, flooding, etc. And there is typically an increased landslide risk in places with steep slopes after wildfire, and flooding and rainwater events, especially atmospheric rivers, can really exacerbate that. So just be aware that there's multi-hazards there and try to coordinate on that at your agency. So thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's attendance. We're going to pause for a sec and take some questions. And I'm just going to post our contacts up here. And just one more plug for the FEMA Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference Guide. It's probably my favorite FEMA guide, and I've read a lot. So definitely check it out. There's a new link available online that I believe Mitch has posted in the chat. So Mitch, do we have any questions you want to address?
Before we get to the questions, I'm going to make a correction. Dennis messaged me and he was looking in the desk reference and has experience with this before. But the question earlier about whether an attached deck counts as part of the substantial damage calculations and whether you need to look at that, I was wrong before. The answer is yes. It does count towards the building and the costs. It's very clear in this desk reference. So thanks, Dennis, for catching that for us.